your research papers. I want to ask you if you would rather write about kind of it's a an autopsy, if you will, on what happened to the election. Why did the Democrats do as poorly as they did? Because they're going to lose the executive branch in Texas. There, I doubt a Democrat will be elected. You might see uh, in the land commissioner's office, you might see a Democrat win, but I'm doubting it. Uh, or do you, and you know Greg Abbott's going to be reelected, and so you might want to talk about why. There's a really good article in the Washington Post that you might want to take a look. I'll send it to everybody about what went wrong in the Beto O'Rourke campaign and why the Democrats. It's not really so much why the Democrats can't win, but the thing is that they can't, and the theory about that, or my personal theory about that, is they don't pay attention to rural Texas, and that's where the votes are. The cities tonight are going to come in for O'Rourke. He's going to carry Dallas County. He's going to carry Harris County. Well, we don't know if the Democrats are winning right now because no votes have been counted. And so they won't start counting votes until 7 o'clock tonight. And those votes are going to come in really rapidly. And with these electronic machines, much easier to count them. There's a lot of absentee ballots, a lot of mail-in, but not as much as you would think. And you're going to know tonight by news time at 10 that Abbott got reelected. And the real analysis is that Democrats do not pay attention to rural votes, and that's where the voting is. Cities can come in for Democrats, but they're not going to win the suburbs, and they're not going to win the rural vote. And until they run candidates that are attractive to rural and suburban voters, they're just not going to win. And the cities cannot gather enough votes to compensate for that in an off year, non-presidential year election. And so voter turnout might be a little bit better this time than usual, but it's not going to be that high a voter turnout. You won't have as many eligible voters voting as you would hope. And I'm going to say something that's going to be really unpopular, but don't assume that the more people that vote, the better the result of that election is going to be. And what do you mean by better? Just because you have more people voting, don't assume that you have more Democratic government as a result of that. What has to happen is you have to have a more informed population in order to get government that's well represented and government that values responsiveness. I'll say this, that just because you may disagree with the government doesn't mean that that government is not responsive to the people who elected it. And so that's very difficult for people to understand. That just and let me say this, that just because you want something really intensely does not mean that other people share those values or share that intensity. Everybody's vote counts the same. Um, and the thinking that there is a right way and a wrong way to look at things in politics is very difficult for people to understand, that really it's just about different interest. And you may really wrestle with this. You may really struggle with this. Do people vote against their own interest? Do people vote against their own interest? What happens is that people vote what matters to them most intensely. I think that people vote their own interest all the time. That idea that people vote against their own interest means that a person who believes that, look at those people, they're all voting against their own interest. That means that people are not voting the way that person believes those people should be voting. But I think people vote what they care about all the time. So if you look at rural Texas and you see the way rural Texas votes and you say, man, that doesn't seem that is their interest. Maybe we're defining what their interests are rather than listening to what those people are saying they're interested in. Okay. It's a little tricky, but rural Texas is interested in farming, is interested in markets for their goods. They firmly believe that government should represent their values. And so that means that they want government more in line with how their values are expressed, which means that they don't believe in a wall of separation between church and state. They don't believe that there is a healthcare crisis or that the answers to those problems are not best served by people from outside rural Texas telling them what their interests are. Can we pause just a second? I've got an upset dog and I need to bring her in here. She didn't come with me. Hang on. Hey, life happens, right? Okay, so maybe, people who don't live in rural Texas are saying there's not a crisis in healthcare. It's not a crisis that there are 100 counties without a hospital. We're managing just fine out here in rural Texas. Outsiders shouldn't be telling us how to handle those problems. I agree that those things might be public policy issues, but it's really important if you're going to solve problems to have the people who are impacted by those problems solving those problems. So you have to kind of look at it that way, and it's frustrating. I know it is, um, but when you have such a deep divide in the value system of Texans, the person who is able to capitalize on that division the most is the person that's going to persevere and is going to be successful. Greg Abbott thoroughly understands rural Texas. Greg Abbott is really able to capitalize on his understanding of rural Texas and to communicate well with that constituency. And he's responsive to that constituency. So it's important to recognize that he doesn't feel compelled to pay a lot of attention to the problems of cities because he's not voted into office with those people. Y'all hang on just normally the ringmaster of the dogs isn't here. Well, I mean, he's normally he is here, but right now he's not. So the dogs are just annoying. I'm sorry about the distraction. So the point is, let's look at that executive branch in Texas because we have a very unusual model for state government in Texas. A model that is a product of Reconstruction after the Civil War. After the Civil War, the South was occupied by Union troops there to enforce the new 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and to enforce the peace agreement between the North and the South. And these union supported governors, like Governor E.J. Davis, were wildly unpopular throughout the South. So when these guys left office, the repercussions of that, when the Democrats got back into power, was to rewrite state constitutions to reflect the anger and dissatisfaction that white Democrats had toward Republican Reconstruction governors. Follow? Does that make sense for you? So, what happened was Texas rewrote the state constitution. And they created a governor, which is the governor, the modern Texas governor, the current existing state. What happened was we created a governor in Texas that was very weak, that the power was fragmented, scattered, not concentrated under one powerful governor like Governor E.J. Davis, but rather we created a governor that if you were to line up all the governors in the country according to power, Texas's governor would be last. It's not a very powerful governor, not like California or New York, where the governor really runs the day-to-day operations of the state. That's not what happens in Texas. That is not what happens in Texas. We have a lot of local control in Texas, or we did, because since the pandemic and the governor's emergency orders, you've had a lot of tension between the governor and county judges and the governor and mayors over who controls those elements of government. Hang on just a second. I got to stop again. I'm really sorry, they were distracting me, and I don't want. I got to think about what I'm talking about here. So the governor of Texas under Reconstruction was so powerful. One of the first things the governor under Reconstruction did, if you remember from our earlier discussions about the Constitution and our earlier discussions about, well, from your reading, that the governor of Texas required Texas school children to go to school. We had a compulsory education law under E.J. Davis. Well, that really angered Texas farmers because that meant that school kids couldn't be working on the farm, couldn't be harvesting crops. They had to be in school. And that was very upsetting because they didn't have the labor that they did have before to harvest crops and to do the hard work, the tough labor on the farm. East Texas, that was all cotton plantations, they no longer could own slaves. Children had to do that labor. And if they were in school, they couldn't do that labor. E.J. Davis used the police, according to his critics, at his own discretion. In other words, the police in the state were under the governor's control, not the cities, not the counties. Interestingly enough, with this Uvalde situation that we just experienced, the murder of those school children and school teachers in Uvalde, while the police sat still for 77 minutes and did nothing. Who was in charge? Could the governor not say, folks, the governor of Texas does not have direct control over the police. The governor appoints a 3-member board who appoints someone to run the day-to-day operations of the Department of Public Safety. That's the state troopers. Locally, the school district's police were in charge. So you have a conflict there. The local school police chief didn't order aggressive attack on the shooter. Well, we had a Texas Ranger there, and the Texas Ranger, they're the legendary police. One riot, one ranger. You're supposed to be able to take care of things. And what did he do? He is now being investigated for talking on his cell phone throughout the conflict rather than aggressively pursuing and mobilizing the over 100 police who were sitting there doing nothing. So let me plant a little suggestion to you here, something for you to keep in the back of your mind. After 9/11, we realized that police in an emergency, in a crisis situation, had a difficult time communicating. Your New York City police could not talk to the fire department, could not talk to the FBI, could not talk to any other law enforcement agencies because the radios didn't even communicate on the same channel. We quickly realized that in a crisis like that, Homeland Security had to be created and formed to help coordinate emergency responders in a crisis. Should we take a cue from that? Is that what we should do if we have a crisis? We have to have somebody coordinate all the why was this? Who dropped the ball? Well, we've had some investigation about this, and I can give you the report to read about this. But there's a legislative session now that's going to begin in January, and perhaps those folks will then uh, that this will uh, this legislative session will address that problem. People ask the governor to please have a special session right after this shooting. Shouldn't we have had a special session to address problems in law enforcement? And the governor did nothing. Y'all, let's be practical. It's an election year. He's not going to do anything controversial, and he's not going to do anything that causes his base not to vote for him. And he has a lot of support from police. And so he wasn't going to restructure and reorder the police, nor was he really going to stick blame for this crisis on the police. And in all fairness, is it really their fault, or is this a systemic problem that the solution of which has to come from above, like the legislature, who's supposed to have oversight? Who's in charge of the police? Who has that direct responsibility? In Texas, y'all, all of these various kinds of responsibility are spread out and fragmented because we had experienced a governor that people found authoritarian and autocratic. And so when you fragmented power like that in an effort to diversify that authority and to make sure, frankly, that all the branches of government are functioning and that you don't have a single person in charge of the whole state, you fragment your power. Okay. So what does this mean? Well, we fragmented the power and we took the governor's ability to appoint, like a cabinet, like the president has a cabinet and he appoints these cabinet officials and they run the day-to-day operations, but they answer to the president. We don't have that in Texas. What you have is an elected lieutenant governor who may not be in the same party as the governor. They can be in different parties. Right now, they're in the same party, but we have had times when the governor and the lieutenant governor were in different parties. You have an independently elected lieutenant governor. You have an independently elected attorney general. You have an independently elected agriculture commissioner. You have an independently elected land commissioner. Those are two different things. The land and then the crops that come out of it is two different things. And an independently elected comptroller. We also have an independently elected railroad commission. And we need to talk about that because the Railroad Commission does not regulate railroads. Railroads are regulated by the federal government. Well, what the heck does the Railroad Commission do? They regulate the oil and gas industry, not the railroad industry. I know it's there for our confusion, isn't it? Okay. So let's talk about each one of these individual offices. And you can visit the websites of each of these offices to get a handle on who these folks are. And you should do that. Hint, hint, test question. And what specific powers each of those offices has. So look at the Lieutenant Governor's office. The Lieutenant Governor is Dan Patrick. And I would argue that he is, in some respects, more powerful than the governor. Why? Because nothing becomes law in this state unless the lieutenant governor wants it to. The lieutenant governor can kill legislation or really get behind and support legislation. The lieutenant governor controls the agenda of the legislative process. And you might be asking yourself, hey, is that not strange? You have somebody who's elected as the executive. You have somebody elected as the executive, yet that person controls the legislative branch. Now, what happened to checks and balances? What happened to checks and balances in that instance? Well, out the window. Because of that desire to make the governor weak, you've got a lieutenant governor. They don't run on a ticket. They're individual candidates. They're individual office holders. There's no policy coordination between these two guys. Okay. Other than now, what has happened in political parties? It does not matter about public policy. People identify with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's this way on both sides. Like team identification, like tribal identification. We really don't have identity politics so much in Texas as we have identification politics. And what I mean by that is this. The Republican Party does not care that there is no exemption in abortion policy for rape and incest. They don't care about that. And your rank and file Republican may say, oh, really, I don't support that. I think there ought to be an exemption for rape and for incest. But that's not what the party says. So I'm gonna follow the party. They identify so strongly with their party, it makes no difference what the finer points of legislation actually are. It makes no difference to them that they might suffer themselves the consequences of this. Nope, they fall in line. What you have on the Democrat side of this is the extreme elements of the Democratic Party participate in the primaries. Those folks are more extreme in their belief systems. And there's not really a lot of room for more moderate, for more middle of the road. And I would argue with you that most people live in the middle of the road. Most people are not far to the left and not far to the right. But the people who participate in politics, particularly the primaries and the writing of that party platform and their agenda, they tend to be your extreme folks. So the moderate voices, the ones who would say, there ought to be an exception for rape or incest, and maybe abortion's too easy to acquire, and maybe we ought to talk about in making it easier on moms to raise children. Maybe we ought to tighten up child support laws, and maybe we should do more with nutrition and pregnancy health care. Those moderate voices get drowned out in the extremes. Let me put it to you this way. Y'all are about to have Thanksgiving dinner with your families, and some of y'all are that's a good point. Somebody brought up, well, maybe they're not really extreme, but they just say that to get elected or to stay in power. I think you got a good point there. And let me interject this real quick before I get to my Thanksgiving analogy. You have got in 45 states election deniers going to get elected tonight. People who refuse to say that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. What does that mean? Well, let me tell you something. No, not that many people have suddenly become delusional. They know they're lying. And they're afraid to tell the truth about things because that means the people who voted for them wouldn't vote for them again. While it is so easy for us to blame political figures for the mess that we're in, what about the voters that this extreme business online, on Reddit, on the 4chan, the QAnon kinds of stuff, that stuff online, those people vote. While the more moderate Americans aren't that interested in the day-to-day grinding wheel of how all of this works. They have trusted the party participants to develop programs, to develop public policy that's workable for the rest of us. What this demands, and I think, Ms. Jimenez, you are onto something here. Moderate voices are not participating in politics. The extremes are governing, and the politicians, as you pointed out, they act extreme because it keeps them elected. And what you get into is a feedback loop here. The politicians are extreme, so the voter is extreme. The voter is extreme, so the politician is extreme. What to do about this? More moderates are going to have to play the game. More moderates are going to have to get involved. Okay? So let me go to my Thanksgiving analogy here for a moment. Some of you may be dreading spending the holidays with your families because you got those extreme members of the family whose answer to everything is always something violent, or whose answer is always something way out there with no, how do I put this delicately? With no grounding in real life situations. For every wild thing they say, you can pull back and say, but wait a minute, I had this friend and they couldn't get health care because, they don't want to hear that stuff. They don't want to hear the real life nitty gritty where the rubber meets the road kind of problems. They they firmly believe that extreme problems deserve extreme answers or just extreme solutions. And they get kind of upset and they yell at you over Thanksgiving dinner, and you just take your plate and go eat in the other room, or go take your plate and sit at the kiddie table, because you can't get along with people. We all have family members that we'd rather not spend time with because they're, yeah, what do you think of people that don't even like to talk about politics? What do you think why do you think they're that way? Um, I think they probably grabbed a hot stove at some time in their life and got really burned about talking about politics. But I want y'all to know I was a weird kid. I mean, I was the most political first grader you would ever have wanted to meet. Um, I remember when I was in the third grade, I won a writing contest because I wrote about pollution in the third grade. So anyway, the point of the matter is, some people don't like to talk about politics because, first of all, your mama told you never to talk about politics or religion with anybody because those things were private, and you don't want to disagree with somebody so strongly that you can't be their friend anymore. Well, what happens then is that we don't know how to talk about politics or religion without getting angry with each other. And I think that you can talk about politics. The country depends on it, y'all. That we're going to have to be able to talk about politics without being offensive to each other. And if you can't talk about it and you get up and you leave the room because somebody hurts your feelings or yells at you or something like that, then you're conceding the ground. If you are going to talk about politics with that uncle or that aunt that is unreasonable, you have to ask them some questions that they may be uncomfortable. You don't have to be the only one uncomfortable. You could make them uncomfortable too. You could ask them, what are you afraid of? You don't like the immigration policy? What are you afraid of? Well, I'm afraid that those people gonna come over here and take our jobs. Well, statistics show that, and talk about the kinds of jobs that immigrants take. They take the jobs that they can get. And a lot of times they do the work that a lot of people don't want to do. I mean, we've had crops rotting in the fields because you do not have people in large numbers coming here to pick those crops. And it used to be, do you know how we used to handle that? We used to have guest worker cards, and people came into the country, did that hard labor, lived in temporary housing, and came back the next year, went back to where they were from. Americans are preferred over people who have different backgrounds. That depends on who we're talking about. You know, that Americans, what you mean, like resident resident Americans? You mean people who are here legally, people who have permission to be here?
Oh, no, I was referring like sometimes they are preferred when they're hiring people.
Uh, who? I'm sorry. Who prefers who?
Like the boss prefers Americans than people from other countries.
And why do you
In,
suppose that? Why do you suppose that is?
because they were born here.
Well, so you think that they get preferential treatment? I think it depends on the job. So you it's, don't assume that everybody that comes here illegally. That's not the case. Most people who come into the country come here legally, documented, they have green cards, and depending upon where you are, here in Houston, we have such an incredibly diverse population that the idea that there is a right or a preferred person for a job is really not necessarily support it. I think that a lot of people are looking at who's qualified to do that job. We have a lot of doctors here who were born in other countries. They're educated in the United States medical system. And so they may uh, have a different country of origin, but their training and their expertise was really developed here in the United States. We have 80 at least different languages spoken in Fort Bend County. You have an incredibly diverse population, but you know what? In Fort Bend County, you have the most educated population in the state concentrated in this county. So workers from here, regardless of their country of origin, are highly desired employees. Why? The education factor. The crisis in education is it's incredibly difficult for people to afford a quality education. Nobody wants to graduate from college with tremendous student debt. And do you know why debt is what it is? Here in Texas, who's responsible for how education is funded? Ideas? Ideas? That would be, brace yourself, the land commissioner. The land commissioner oversees the permanent university fund. The permanent university fund is monies that come from oil and gas leases and cattle feeding leases throughout the state of Texas. The money that comes in from those leases goes into the permanent university fund, and that used to pay for colleges and universities throughout the state, and it was why Texas education was as affordable as it was. A person who's from Texas, whose residency is in Texas, could go to the University of Texas and it could be paid for. How do I say this? 1 year of tuition at a school comparable to the University of Texas outside of Texas would pay for 4 years of UT or 4 years of A&M. And that was great. That's why people came to school here, because state schools were incredibly much more affordable than four-year institutions, state schools in other states. But what's happened is this: we have cut taxes back so far, and we have made these leases so inexpensive that we no longer get the funding from state sources like we did. And that expense of going to UT or A&M or one of their satellite schools is passed on to the student. It used to be that only about 17% of the operating cost of a university was paid out of students' tuition. Now that number is just exponentially higher. And so students are paying for the operating cost of colleges and universities with their student loans and keep paying that long after they've left that institution. So Texas is losing out. Kids don't go to school here as much as they used to. Enrollments are down. And they're down for a lot of reasons. Okay, they're down for a lot of reasons. But part of the problem with all of this, y'all, is people can't afford to go to school here anymore. I'm not talking about private schools. I'm not talking about Rice and Baylor. SMU, TCU. Those four schools, those four private schools, all cost, brace yourself, get ready to swallow hard, about $50,000 in tuition. What does that mean? It means heavy student debt for kiddos that go to school at those institutions. But it also means that very wealthy people are the only ones that can afford to go to those schools. Therefore, there is a kind of, well, there's a real lack of economic diversity. In other words, you have to be so wealthy to get there that lower middle income and low income people are not going to those schools. And that's a shame because you used to have a real mix at those institutions. But now it's wealthy kids going to school with wealthy kids. And what does that mean? It means that they don't understand the problems of poor students who are there on financial need, and it's very difficult for you to get a good mix of students at those institutions, so they don't learn much about each other because they're not exposed to each other. So the legislature has cut funding to colleges and universities. The permanent university fund is not managed the way it used to be, and the resources are not there the way it used to be. And so the cost of school is passed on to kids who are funding this forever on student loans that they can't pay back because they're just astronomically, ridiculously high. Okay. Who is responsible for the permanent university fund? That would be the land commissioner. The general land office is responsible for revenues that come in from oil and gas leases on public lands. Most states, when they joined the Union, gave up their public lands to the United States government. Texas did not. So when you're looking out there at Marathon and West Texas and all of that, that is not federal land. If you look at a map of the United States, most of Wyoming, most of Colorado, most of Idaho and Utah and did I say Montana? And South Dakota and North Dakota, all of that is U.S. federal land managed by the Department of the Interior. Okay. That land is Texas land. So Texas gets the benefit of all of that area. Texas gets the benefit of it. Texas didn't give up their land. So that's where a lot of tax revenue or oil and gas lease, or when you can't feed all of your cattle, you lease that land that belongs to the state of Texas so that you can feed your cows on that land. Okay. That's the land commissioner's responsibility, not the agriculture commissioner. What's the agriculture commissioner do? The ag commissioner is responsible for enforcing all agriculture law in the state of Texas. And it's a huge industry. Y'all forget that Texas is an agriculture state. Billions of dollars in agricultural exports. We actually export rice to Asian countries that do not produce enough rice for consumption. Texas agriculture. Cotton. Egypt used to be the primary cotton distributor, producer in the world. The South in the United States rivals that. You've got Texas and Louisiana producing the lion's share of cotton on the global level. So those fine, expensive cotton shirts from, you know, menswear stores, Brooks Brothers, that cotton originates in Texas, unless it's actually labeled Egyptian cotton. That cotton came from Texas. That cotton came from Louisiana. Huge cotton producers. Okay. Plus the breadbasket, plus feeding those avocados that yuppie type folks enjoy, the production through Texas. Oranges, citrus, oranges, grapefruit, tremendous production in those areas. Beef, 25% of the nation's beef comes from Texas. So the agriculture commissioner is responsible for the laws that deal with pesticide use, with marketing all of this produce, with providing services out there in rural Texas so that farmers and ranchers have access to laws and policy that make their production possible. That's tremendously important. And most Texans have no idea that Sid Miller is the agriculture commissioner that's responsible for that. But if you are into agriculture and you're producing out in rural Texas, you know who that is. You know who that is. And if you have questions, that office is incredibly responsive to the needs of rural producers out there in the county, as we like to say. Okay. So food doesn't come from grocery stores. Grocery stores don't make that food. All right. Uh, it's produced, well, we have imports from all over the world, but I want you to realize that Texas has exports from all over the world. What does the comptroller do? The comptroller is the state's tax collector. And the comptroller tells the legislature, yes, indeed, you have enough money to perform that budget that you passed, or no, you're going to have to raise taxes in order to produce enough revenue to perform that budget. And I really recommend that you go up to the comptroller's website because it is a fascinating area to tell you about where Texans pay taxes. It's an amazing, important, useful tool for you to understand tax policy. So you're looking at a lieutenant governor that really controls what becomes law because he controls what's discussed. If he doesn't want a bill to come up for discussion, it won't. You have an agriculture commissioner that's responsible for all agricultural laws and assistance to farmers and ranchers. You have a land commissioner that's responsible for all of Texas public lands. It's miles and miles of Texas. Okay. You have got uh, these elected independently, and they're executives. The governor is not their boss. They act independently of the governor. But my favorite office in the executive branch, because he used to work at the Attorney General's office, I was Attorney General Jim Maddox's legislative analyst. I was 25 years old, just finishing my master's degree. And the Attorney General of Texas, Jim Maddox, had been my congressman growing up. And I had a plum job that he picked me to do. He hired me. And what did I do? But I read every piece of legislation filed and told the Attorney General this legislation impacts the office of the Attorney General this way. And I helped develop what were called fiscal notes, that told us how to pay for whatever power expansion the legislature was giving to the attorney general. So I interpreted legislation for him and told him what that legislation meant, told him when committee meetings were about that legislation so that he could go and speak on whether or not the agency wanted to embrace that power and should this be something the legislature devoted their time to. It was a wonderful job. And I taught people how to track legislation through the system and taught others how to read legislation and see the impact that it had on the Attorney General's office. It was terrific and I loved it and I learned an awful lot. I worked for Attorney General Jim Maddox. The Attorney General is the state's civil lawyer. The Attorney General is the person who interprets state law. And if he says that a law is unconstitutional, then it is. If he says that a particular law does not comport to the state constitution, then that law is unconstitutional unless somebody wants to challenge him in the Texas Supreme Court. And so his word has constitutional power. And that's an awful lot of power in one person. Okay. So the Attorney General represents the consumers of Texas. And so when there's a consumer fraud issue, it's the Attorney General's office that pursues it. He is not responsible for prosecuting crime in Texas. Who does that? Who's responsible for prosecuting crime? Your local district attorney. And these are two different orbs that do not revolve around each other. Okay, they are two different planets, criminal and civil. Okay, criminal prosecution is the local district attorney's responsibility. The attorney general deals with civil matters like nursing home care that's inappropriate because they regulate the state's nursing homes. What if somebody is running a charity, but they're really pocketing the money instead of distributing the money? Like, let's say that they create some cancer charity or something, and they don't actually distribute that money to cancer victims. They keep it themselves. Who deals with that? That's the Attorney General's office because nonprofits and charities are regulated by the Attorney General. District attorneys might prosecute them for a felony, but regulation of them is done by the Attorney General. And the Attorney General can go after them civilly. He can sue them and maybe sue them out of existence or prevent them from ever having the ability to run a charity in Texas. Okay. So, just as a little bit of trivia, uh, the current Attorney General, Kim Paxton, I went to Baylor with, used to sit next to me in history class. And his wife, Angela, he dated her at Baylor, and she's a state senator now. So it's a small world, but I wouldn't want to paint it. At any rate, that's the collection of child support is a duty and responsibility of the Texas Attorney General's office. He got that authority when I was working for him. We said, sure, give that to us. We'll take on that responsibility. The Department of Human Services in Texas wasn't doing a very good job at that. And so we wanted to take that on. So we did. And under the Maddox administration, child support collection increased 700%. And Texas to this day is dead last in this country in child support collection. We are at the bottom of all 50 states in child support collection. Why is that? They don't give that agency enough money to go after people who really need to be in jail for not paying child support. But let me say something about that. It's really not a good idea to put people in jail because they haven't paid their child support. Because if they're in jail, they're not working, and then they can't pay their child support. The bottom line is, how do we get money to that kiddo that needs it? That's the important public policy problem. Employers pay people who are subject to child support collection under the table. They pay them in cash instead of a check because the Attorney General could garnish that check. And so businesses who let these people not pay their child support, they're not doing children a bit of good in the state of Texas by paying people cash instead of officially paying. I see that it's 4:30 and I've kept y'all an hour. Do you have any questions or comments or worries? I have revamped our website because people had a hard time reaching it. And I will send you that link this evening so that you can see this tape. And in the class before, we'll just start with those tapes, putting those up so that they're available to you so that you can review these for your test purposes. And some people couldn't make it to class today. I hope that they were out voting. Has anybody voted today? Were the lines long? I have not heard. Did anybody have any trouble in line? I voted early last week. I voted Thursday, and I didn't have any wait at all. I walked right in me. So did y'all have trouble? Let me see what people's comments. Somebody said very for me. Did Miss Santana? Did you have trouble voting? Did you have a long line? Somebody said they hadn't had a chance to vote yet. Get out there and vote, Mr. DeLeon. Get out there and do your part, okay? Y'all quit, okay? Long lines. Somebody said LOL. So it really was bad standing in line. Yeah, long lines. Get out there and do it. Now let me say this about it. If you're in line and you have not yet voted and it's 7:00, they have to let you vote because you were in line. Okay? So go get in line. Some school districts had off. When you say essays, it's going to be an essay or discussion. It's a discussion. I just thought maybe you might want to work on your initial remarks, and then y'all have to respond to each other. And of course, you want to respond with facts. Somebody wrote me a very compelling note and said they wanted to write about the Uvalde situation. Do y'all want to talk about Uvalde and that shooting situation, or do you want to talk about why Beto O'Rourke lost? And you know what? If he wins, you can talk about what a surprise that was. Let me know. Y'all write to me and let me know what you want to do. Okay, where can you find the discussion? I haven't posted it yet. That's what I'm asking y'all. What do you want to write about? There'll be a big old link on your page saying discussion here. And I have to give you the topic. Okay, I'll give you the topic. And here's the bonus. I will do all of the research for you and give you 3, 4, 5 articles to read. And you can use those as your sources for the article. But the discussion will be posted, and I will send each of you individually the discussion question and all of the research. If y'all will let me know what you want to write about. And I'm opening it to y'all because there's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe y'all don't want to talk about the election. Maybe y'all want to talk about Uvalde. And you got a lot of issues there, school safe day. Oh, yeah, I mean the YouTube channel. Absolutely. I've got a new YouTube channel, and I think it'll be more useful to you. And I will send you the link to that too. Okay. Questions? Comments? All right, let's quit, and I will see you guys. Thank you for your patience with me and herding the dogs as we're trying to get through this. We'll talk to y'all on Thursday, okay? Take care. Thank you so much. Y'all have a good afternoon. Enjoy it.
Thank you, Professor. You
Thank
too.
you. Bye.